What's your background?
Incorporate the town. And this is
What
how
do? I study, for 30 years I worked with think tanks studying right-wing social movements in the U.S. and Europe.
Oh my.
If there's a seat next to you that's empty, could you please raise your hand?
Chip.
There's still some seats.
Oh, bless you. Sustenance. But I'm like the closet socialist, no, not closet, socialist Christian.
They did a survey in Britain where much to everyone's shock they found out that actual churchgoers were more likely to vote left-wing than right-wing.
Are you affiliated with the university?
Yes, actual churchgoers.
Yeah.
Other than the people who report themselves as actual churchgoers.
Exactly.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me back there in the back all right? Yeah? If you can't hear me back there, let me know. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to Religion and Science, or Science and Religion, however you want to look at it. We have 4 distinguished panelists this morning. Before we get to that, I want to just remind everyone there's probably somebody here who forgot to turn off a cell phone. So if you please do that now, I thank you very much, and please don't text and so forth. And we'll get started. We're going to have each of our panelists speak for around 7 or 8 minutes, just to give a little opening statement on their views on the subject. And then we'll have a little discussion perhaps between them for a couple of minutes each. They might ask each other a question or give each other some trouble of some kind. And then we will ask the audience to come forward to either of the microphones to ask a question. Questions only, please, rather than lengthy statements. And students, because this is a university, of course, have priority. So over anyone else, and hopefully everyone who wishes to speak can do so. So we may begin. I'd like to first introduce Chip Burleigh, who is a journalist and photojournalist. He has made a lifelong study of right-wing movements and conspiracy theories, so I can't wait for this. He writes in the New York Times. He's been on the Today Show, NPR, and spoken and written all over the U.S. and Europe. Please welcome Chip Burleigh.
Oh, they're all looking at me because I came late. I start.
Yeah.
That's right.
Nice. You're all going to pay. So it all happened when Calvin ran into Darwin. Now, obviously, this didn't happen in real time. Well, I don't think it did. But the fact is, if you look at sacred text, no matter what religion that has sacred text, it is unlikely that at the time there were people recording the words of their sacred master. So that for most religions, there is an idea that even if you say that you need to read sacred texts literally, they don't mean that literally. And I'll give you an example. In Catholicism, there is often in the Bible that is used in many Roman Catholic groups, at the beginning of the book of Revelation, it says, read this as a marvelous metaphor. See? Right. Because there's several interesting things to know about that. And the most important is that if you start to claim that sacred text is to be read completely literally, and that somebody in a position of authority gets to say what it means, that's a problem. Now, that's not a problem if the religion is open to people discussing it. And there are obviously in hierarchical religions, there you have a pope. The pope gets to say what certain things mean. But I've been in Catholic discussion groups with folks who are open to discussing larger interpretations. So why does this matter? Darwin. Was the Earth created in 7 days? Does that mean that the Flintstones hung out with the dinosaurs. Well, why do some people today who vote, which is their right, why do some people today who vote think that we hung out and rode on the backs of the dinosaurs, ignoring the fact that the non-vegetarian dinosaurs would have eaten us? The problem is the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and most major Protestant denominations in the 1800s reached an accommodation with science that basically said, isn't it marvelous that scientists are discovering all these things that God did? And that just took care of the problem. Why didn't this happen in the United States when it happened in most other countries? Has to do with a battle that occurred in the late 1800s over what America, the idea of the rugged individual, the idea of a whole bunch of things that are seen as the American creed, was embraced by a group of pastors within Protestantism who thought that this agreement that science was an endless discovery that was compatible with believing in a supreme being. These pastors thought that that violated the book of Genesis. And they began to write. They wrote a lot. They wrote 12 pamphlets called The Fundamentals of Christianity. And that's where the term fundamentalism comes from. Now, why does this matter? Well, because, do you remember the Scopes monkey trial? Okay. Who remembers which side won? Yeah. The state won. Teaching evolution was banned. So the evolution people lost that case. Now, what happens is fascinating, at least to me, is that fundamentalists who defended the right to not teach evolution, and this was back, oh boy, as 1870s Darwin theory really was set into the mold of whether you accepted it or not within religion. The 12 pamphlets of the fundamentalists were written between 1909 and 1912. Between 1921 and 1929, fundamentalist Christians introduced 35 bills in 20 states against the teaching of evolution. This leads to the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. But what happens is people like H.L. Mencken are very acerbic, to say that's the politest term. A vicious journalist, and I'm a journalist, but you should read him, took on the fundamentalists as boobs, and eviscerated the entire movement across the country in national columns, and so did a lot of other opinion writers. And what happened is the fundamentalists got pissed off. But their solution was to withdraw from civil society to a large extent, even though they won most of these cases. But they basically decided that civil society was not something that they felt comfortable engaging in because they got slapped in the face. And they basically hid. They didn't go away, and that's what's crucial. They hid from the public eye until the 1950s, at which time Billy Graham and a group of corporate millionaires and the U.S. State Department decided that communism was a really big threat and the voting ranks were dwindling, and therefore it was very important that churches get involved in getting people back into the polling booths. Now, interestingly enough, fundamentalists didn't do that. But a lot of evangelicals and a lot of other people did. How am I doing on time?
A couple more minutes.
So we'll skip a few years. What happens is Jimmy Carter calls himself born again. Okay? And that's music to the ears of fundamentalists and evangelicals. And so after Billy Graham brought people back into the voting booth, between that and Jimmy Carter saying that, you could not tell how a person was going to vote based on any kind of demographic that had to do with religion. Just couldn't. That was not the major focal point of their election allegiances. When Jimmy Carter announced that he was born again, a huge number of evangelicals who previously voted Republican voted Democratic. This was not ignored by Christian right leaders who said, gee, if Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, can bring people back to the polls, maybe we should have a moral majority. So a group of political activists met with a group of evangelical ministers, and they decided to assign Jerry Falwell the task of creating a moral majority, which would get people to vote Republican. What happens is very interesting because in the Reagan election, fundamentalists returned to the polls to vote Republican. That felt pretty good when they helped elect a president, and some of them got some political payoff. Certainly the Christian right did. And thus begins the return of the Scopes monkey trial, in which it becomes a political football embraced by the Republicans to look the other way at some of the Christian right theories and actions and beliefs, and currently look the other way at passing laws that demonize and stigmatize whole groups of people that these folks don't like gay people. Who's next? And that's the dilemma we find ourselves because, wait for it, the vast majority of Christians and religious people in the United States have no problem with science.
Thank you, Chip. Our next opening statement will be from Guy Consolmagno, who is formerly of MIT and has a PhD in planetary science. He was curator of the Vatican Observatory, and he must have a great sense of humor because he has appeared on the Colbert Report, and he's has won the Carl Sagan Medal as an outstanding scientist. So please welcome Guy Consolmagno.
Well, as you can guess, being a Jesuit brother and a planetary scientist working at the Vatican, I do these things a lot. So the first thing I ought to do is to buy all of my books, and you'll have everything explained there. They're so good, buy 2 copies each. The point, I'm going to leave the realm of the political, which is I think probably what's drawing everybody in here, and so I think the comments we just heard were very useful, especially to remind us that the whole idea of a split between science and religion dates from the end of the 19th century. Absolutely. It is not a fundamental bit of history. When the Vatican Observatory was established was exactly at the end of the 19th century. We'd had astronomers at the Vatican before, but this was the time when Pope Leo XIII said, we've got to show the world that we are not against science, because suddenly people are tarring us with that. Part of the politics was to keep people with vowels at the end of their name, like Consolmagno, from polluting the pure American breed. My grandfather came to America in 1899. And they did it. They succeeded, because the really strict anti-immigration laws were passed that kept Italians and Poles from coming into the country in the numbers that they had been before. And it's not just the right wing that were behind that, because the left wing, who wanted to make sure there wasn't a lot of cheap labor to water down the labor union movement, also conspired to keep people like my grandfather and great-grandfather from coming here. It's all tied up in politics. But there's also a lot of history that is well worth looking at, and a lot of philosophy. I'm going to give you a little bit of the history and a little bit of the philosophy. History. Who does science? Who actually gets to be a scientist? Nowadays, we hope that it looks like the general population, though in fact, if you looked at who are the people who are getting NASA grants, people of color are terribly underrepresented. I'm doing my best as a people of color, but it's not the same thing. I also don't get any money from NASA anymore. At least nowadays there are a good number of women, but certainly when I was a grad student, there were mostly males, white males, who were doing science. And when my father, who wanted to be an astronomer, was going through in the 1930s, the idea that somebody named Consolmagno could be the astronomers were named Percival Lowell. If you look historically, what does it take to be an astronomer? You have to, or to be a scientist in general. You have to have an education. You have to have an income. You have to have free time. Because being a scientist is not going to make you rich. It's not going to make you famous. It's not going to get you girls. At least it didn't work for me. If you look in the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, which were published starting in 1665, and we've got the full run sitting on the shelf at the Vatican Observatory in the room across from my office, so I could just walk across the hallway and pull one off. And ask yourself, who's doing science? They're noblemen. They're always people who already got family money someplace. We talk about degrees Kelvin. He was Lord Kelvin who managed to come up with that thing. Or they're medical doctors, because it's part of their job. Or they're clergymen. A large number of the people who are writing scientific papers in the 17th and 18th and even into the 19th century are the Reverend this, the Reverend that. Who's the guy who came up with the idea of genetics? A monk, Gregor Mendel. Who's the first person to classify stars by their spectra? A priest, Angelo Secchi, who built his telescope on the roof of a big church in Rome. Great place to have a telescope. Who is the guy who came up with the Big Bang Theory, for heaven's sake? Georges Lemaitre, Catholic priest. So the idea that there is a split between science and religion is immature, to say the least. But there is a fundamental place and a fundamental reason why there's a connection between science and religion. Science is a logical activity. All activity of logic starts with the rules of logic, including you can't have a logical system without some assumptions. You always have to start with axioms. And there are 3 axioms to science which are fundamentally religious. And I mean this by saying that not all religions have these axioms. Only certain religions do. You have to believe that the universe is real, that I'm actually studying something real, that you're not just the projection of my own warped imagination. And unless you're doing quantum physics, you believe that the universe is real. You have to believe that the universe operates by laws. Now, we're all used to that because we've got laws and they work, but who was the first person to think that there were laws? Where did that idea come from? If you are a Roman pagan and you believe that lightning occurs because the god of lightning threw the bolt, and crops grow because the goddess of crops made the crops grow, then you're not going to be looking for other rules and reasons. The universe looks chaotic enough. It's nice to believe that there are these free will entities out there who are causing things to happen, and if I could just, sacrifice the right things at the right time, maybe that lightning bolt will hit him and not me. It's only if you don't believe in pagan nature gods that you have the room to ask, okay, then how does the universe work? And the ancient Romans persecuted the Christians because they thought we were atheists, because we didn't believe in all of the gods they believed in. And I remind you to this day that the only difference between Stephen Hawking and me, I only believe in one more God than he does. And it could well be that the God he doesn't believe in is a God I don't believe in either. The third thing, and this is the hardest thing for Congress to understand, is that in order to do science, you have to think that it's worth doing in and of itself. If you think the physical universe is a source of evil and corruption, and chocolate was put out there just to lure you into destroying your diet, then your goal is to leave the physical universe behind and try to get yourself to a higher plane, and you'll be a very wonderfully spiritual person, but you're not going to be a scientist. But if you believe that the physical universe is made by a loving God who encourages you to learn about the Creator by the things that were created, which is a quote from Paul's letter to the Romans, by the way. If you believe that at every stage of the outside God who's not part of nature doing creation however it was done, and there are at least 5 different creation stories that are contradict each other in terms of the detail, because that's not what's important in the Bible. What's important was that it was a deliberate act of somebody outside of nature who said, this is good stuff. And if you happen to believe that God so loved the world that, he sent his son, which is the whole point of Christianity, then studying the world is an act of worship. Absolutely. And, St. Athanasius says the incarnation makes the universe sacred. Then, not only do you have the chance and the excuse to say, I can justify spending my life, and I can see the world full of chocolate because chocolate is a sign of God's love, not a form of temptation.
Yeah, you bet.
Well, I gave a talk at the College of Charleston about 20 years ago. And a kid came up and said, I want to be a geologist. Well, I studied geology. Geology is great. And he says, what do I tell my mom? And I realized this is South Carolina. If your society believes that doing science is evil, even if you think otherwise, you're going to have a whole lot of pressures stopping you from doing it. Not even the fact that you're not going to get funded, but that the fact that people are going to think that you're doing something worthless or worse yet, evil. Mm-hmm. You need a series of assumptions about the universe and how it works and what's right and wrong within that universe to be able to have the space to have the community of people who do the science.
Thank you, Guy. Our next panelist is Dr. David Brin, who's a scientist and science fiction writer. He also wrote a book many of you may be familiar with called The Postman, which was turned into a film. And he wrote a book called Will Tech Force Us to Choose Between Privacy and Religion?
Privacy and freedom.
Privacy and freedom. Okay.
Slightly different.
That's okay. Got religion on
I'm
my
working
mind.
on that other book.
Got religion on my mind.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I was going to say that was in 1998, which is quite prescient because that is a major subject today with all that's going on the internet. Perhaps you even comment on that at some time. He has a PhD from Caltech. He's an advisor to NASA, and he's appeared on PBS, NPR, BBC, and many other places. Welcome, please, David Brin.
The Colbert Report did set a crew. They spent 7 hours in my home talking to me, and I was not put on at all. So you outrank me. And as far as this young lady next to me is concerned, she appears on all those channels far more often than I do, despite the fact that she has that MIT ring.
Caltech, what are you saying? I was a postdoc at Caltech.
Caltech, excuse me, that's what we call it. Well, all right, I'm going to be contrary. My blog is Contrary Brin, and I'm going to be contrary here and be the one who stands up for the people who aren't here, which is we all know our pals, the atheists, who are becoming quite militant lately. And I'm going to stack up by first saying that throughout history, there have been, in every culture, transcendentalists, mostly male, leaping and hopping outside the temple saying, the hand we were given is garbage. Here's a way to transcend the hand that we were dealt. Back in watch Monty Python's Life of Brian to see what they were like. I was there then, and they captured it accurately. Leaping and hopping, and sometimes they wind up taking over the temple. Or at least portions of the temple or portions of the canon, as happened with the book of Revelation. Today we have transcendentalists who are offering us these notions of a redealt hand through science and technology. And whereas this time they may be right, because sometimes they have a convincing shtick, Ray Kurzweil and his Singularity is here, Peter Diamandis and his new book Abundance, all of these wonderful, wonderful, dazzling diadems held out, but the personality remains the same. I don't like the hand we were dealt. And you'll notice that we see this same thing in Jesus, Socrates, Buddha, and so on. And that is, the world is really not so hot. Extend yourself beyond the world. And then they diverge from one another in the detailed prescription. Transcend the world through the abnegation of the self and meditation. Transcend the world through logic and reason. Transcend the world through prayer and acceptance of the gift of being forgiven for something that should never have been held against you in the first place in any just situation called original sin, which, of course, we could spend hours about. But I wanted to put this in the context because I went ahead, because I'm a contrarian, and whereas here I am saying some things acerbic about standard religion, which has usually been co-opted in these pyramidal social structures that I've been talking about, by the kings and the lords and those with money, turning the priesthood into a propaganda mechanism to say, this is good. It's good that his sons will own your sons and daughters. It's good. It's ordained. Well, starting when this started falling apart, you started seeing some backpedaling. After Galileo, you started seeing backpedaling. And a refurbishment, saying, well, we're going to lose this power anyway, we might as well say we're on the side of the poor. We're going to be losing our dominance over the priestly interpretation of all that's real. So now we're going to back up and say, okay, you can have the physical world, the 99.9999999% of everything out there, but we interpret life. And so you have backpedaling from life, and now it's the soul. And I'm not saying this is wrong. By the way, I am not, by any strict interpretation, certainly by the interpretation of Dawkins and their ilk, an atheist. I'm working on a monograph here in which I believe that the principal job of theology is to corner God by saying this clearly can't be, like original sin. Anybody who would institute that doctrine doesn't deserve any
Good times.
Respect from us, and I don't care if that consigns me to eternity because, that's just your deal. It's nothing having to do with me. And if there's time, I'll talk to you about what a real saint would do. In my latest novel, and in that monograph, I talk about, which is not a novel, though some people will interpret it that way, just as I consider Karl Marx to be the greatest of all science fiction novels. The notion is that you step outside, you can ask for the great sermon. Right now, you can go outside and you can say, with due respect, and simply as a respectful experiment, and please don't strike me, I hereby request, my typical experiment, that you give me a clear and explicit sign right now. The great sermon answer that you will get, and I think we're in agreement in this, is ambiguity. I interpret it as figure it out for yourselves. You probably interpret it as seek me through faith. But in any event, the sermon is ambiguity, which there are claims that in the past it wasn't so ambiguous. But the sermon of ambiguity leads into the notion that if you carve all this stuff away, there are still places where he or she might reside. Some strong places. But they come down to the notion that when at contrarian, I haven't lost any hair the way you did. It's all from switching hats. The notion that when I was being a contrarian, among the others, at the other extreme, the Singularity Conference. And the title of my talk was, So You Want to Make Gods. How could that possibly go wrong? And I berated them as brilliant alphas whose principal job should be this, to avoid this happening to you. And I click and I show a depiction of Giordano Bruno being burned at the stake. And if a large fraction of their fellow citizens think of them as heretical and evil, that could happen while they're trying to make gods, or while they're trying to make themselves into gods, or doing their transcendental leap and hop. And so avoiding this end is essential. How do you do that? You talk to your neighbors. And your alphas, you should be able to read the touchstone scriptures upon which your neighbors base what has become an anti-science trend. And so I recite scripture to them and I show them. I challenge them. Who in here, this room, can tell me what is the purest, most innocent, most collegial, and most telling moment in Scripture? I'll give you a clue. It happens before sin. And all the whole Megillah of redemption from sin or avoiding sin that makes up 99.99999% of the rest. The sacrifice of the Son was after sin. Don't eat of the fruit. That's a negative. And you notice what else it says? If they eat of this, nothing will be beyond them. What happened before that? I'll give you a clue. Before Eve,
And it was good.
he asks, and it's telling that you don't know because it's been ignored. God asks Adam to name the beasts. And it is the most collegial moment. It is the one purest, me and you moment in the entire Bible. And what is naming stuff? Oh, assistant director at Goddard. It is science. But it is a more telling moment a little later. The Tower of Babel, another thing that we just brush aside. Now, in the Quran and the Book of Mormon, God is actually angry when they're building this tower. But in the original source material, in Genesis, there is not a lick of anger. Not a bit. A page before, he drowns the world. A page after, he's dumping fire and brimstone on people who give away their daughters in order so that angels can be spared from being harassed. At the Tower of Babel, it is simply said, if they keep this up, nothing will be beyond them. And what I don't get is why the attention is paid for what he then does. He then disperses us with multiple language. And nobody pays any attention to the second half of that sentence. It is they have the potential for nothing to be beyond them. And that's the second time it's said. All right, so he disperses us. We have to learn diversity. We have to have a lot of pain. That's what he does when he sends Adam and Eve out. He doesn't kill them. He says, go get jobs. You're so smart, you kids. If you look at these things, the main lesson that I have for you is this, that I have used this in conversations with fundamentalists and evangelicals. And I have come away from them having edged them toward more friendliness with science, and they're friendlier to me because I bothered to talk to them on a basis that they understand, and that's what I preached at the Singularitarians. If you can do this, then maybe you won't be burned at the stake. I have a lot more to say, but I think I've used up my time, so I'm just going to say that in my novel Existence, there is a page in which the mayor of Boulder in the year 2045 sues the city of Colorado Springs for a bet that they made 20 years before whether or not Boulder would sink into hell in the year 2030. And Boulder won, and I'm pleased to say that this one page is probably my best sales pitch for you guys. I had an essay online just before the year 2000 called Whose Millennium that discussed this whole business that you would have a lot of millennialist panic and all of that in the year 2000. But I also said they'll figure out that 2,000 years after the birth, you do know the most celebrated of all holidays is 8 days after Christmas. It's the day that a nice Jewish boy was circumcised, right? It's called New Year's. It's celebrated far more than around the world than Christmas. Never mind that. But the point is that we have got to end this phase of the Civil War and build a fairly sane and stable society before 2030. Why? Because it will be 2,000 years since Easter. 2,000 years since birth? Brush it off. 2,000 years since Easter? You ain't seen nothing like the tsunami of millennialism that we're going to see then. We have got to sane up and get IQ pills fast.
Thank you, Dr. Brin. Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Dr. Michelle Fowler, who is a scientist with NASA. She's formerly at Caltech. She's appeared on National Geographic Channel, History Channel, Science Channel, and has won numerous awards, including the award for Women in Aerospace. Please welcome Dr. Michelle Fowler.
Unlike Brother Guy, this is actually not something I get asked to comment on very much. And I was sort of wondering, what I bring to the table in the discussion. The funny thing is, he and I did a piece for NPR just recently where we talked a bit about this. That's like the only other time I've ever publicly talked about science and religion. But I think that David just said, speaking on behalf of our friends, the atheists who aren't here, so I'm going to look at him and go, boo. I think what I can offer you today... like I said, this is not my area of expertise. I'm not a philosopher. However, I'm going to try to give you a little view into a scientist's mind. And I completely agree that the battle, the conflict between science and religion is political. And, it's some sort of artificial wedge that's being driven between us. Nobody here is monolithic, whether you say you believe in God or not. It's one of my least favorite questions. Because if somebody asks me that, and it has happened publicly, do you believe in God? If I say yes, does that mean we believe the same things? And if I say no, what are your assumptions about me? I mean, our beliefs may be more similar than you think. So, one of the things in my life is to run away from labels. I don't like them. I don't like female. I don't like woman. I don't like scientist. A human I'm kind of okay with. This is the great heresy of human existence. We have far more in common than we have differences. My life, whether I call myself an atheist or whether we call ourselves a believer, we have far more in common than anything that's different. So let me talk to you a bit about that. I mean, I actually did an entire lecture for the Library of Congress on the story of Galileo. And this is another place where it's been put up as a conflict of science and religion, but of course that was not the case. It was political. Even the depiction in the latest Cosmos of the execution of Giordano Bruno, I thought was simplified and really very, very ignorant. The Cardinal Bellarmine, who was the Grand Inquisitor at the time, is somebody I've come to quite admire when I actually read more about him. These things, we get this. There is no simple conflict between science and religion. Now, the thing about science is that people often think that science is a substitute for religion. And this is something that I argue against a lot, because I believe that there are fundamental differences. And that is that science is a process by which we can agree on experimental results. There's always such a thing as conjectural scientific theory, what happens inside a black hole that we can't prove yet. There's probably an answer, but we do have no way to prove it. That's conjectural theoretical science that's useful to help guide us. But in the end, you only get a Nobel Prize in science if your results can be proven by many different groups. And religion, I think, has to be at its basis about an individual experience of God, of the universe, of morality. We come into this world alone, and what happens to us after we die is something we go into as an individual. And it is not a reproducible experience. If somebody comes up to me and says, but I had a personal experience of Jesus Christ, there's nothing I can say to either support or negate that. That is your existence. That is your individual experience. Science has limits. People sometimes try to make us into high priests. Tell us the answers. Tell us what began the universe. Tell us how the universe will end. And they seem incredibly disappointed when we know that there are no answers to that. And part of being a careful scientist is being very aware of what you do not know. And being very aware that you never actually reach ultimate truth. If you're doing it right, our theories of the world become more and more to resemble truth. They get closer to the truth. And of course, the example we all use is Einstein. The theories of Einstein are 100 years old. This year is the 100th anniversary of the theory of general relativity. And in those 100 years, we have not been able to prove any deviation from Einstein's calculations. We see light bending around black holes and around pulsars and around dark matter, and all of that. As many decimal places as we can calculate, it matches Einstein exactly. There's some powerful stuff there. But we know it's not the end. There will be something that comes on to supersede Einstein. Einstein does not work in very small spaces like quantum mechanics does. So we understand that our two best descriptions, and quantum mechanics is great. I mean, it is the best predictor of how small things will behave. So, you have to understand that I have no truth to offer you. I have a process where we get closer to truth. And this is one of the reasons why when people sometimes say, well, what set off the Big Bang? Isn't the answer to that God? You can understand why that's not a very compelling point to me. That God, whatever God may be, doesn't exist in places we haven't explored yet exclusively, right? The idea that as we explored the universe and things like lightning became explained, as we pushed out, maybe God lives above the sky. Maybe God lives off the earth. Maybe God lives in a different dimension. Ever since we were poking our heads out of caves, we always put God around the next horizon. People of faith and of science get that pattern, right? So just because I don't know what set the Big Bang off doesn't mean that someday we will know it, and God doesn't have to retreat then when we find that out. And, we also know that there was never a time where we said, okay, we've explained atmospheric dynamics, but lightning, that really was Thor. Yes, check. Of course not. And so, these are some of the arguments that I don't find very emotionally compelling at all. The other thing that I think is a misperception is that as a scientist, I am devoid of emotion and love and complexity and contradiction. I'll let you in on a secret. I pray every day. I called myself an atheist. I need prayer in my life. I need contemplation. I need to worship something. I bring offerings to the mountains I've been observing trips on. I pour out libations at New Year to whoever wants them. It's funny, but it's a little bit of my life, right? And the way I interpret that is human psychology. I live inside a brain like you do. I have the same feelings that you do. In my sense, I've rationalized that to be the way a human brain works, the way you and I work as we breathe. I've not found a need for an external reason for that, and I'm not ashamed of it. So, I'm also not really impressed by the idea that scientists don't have enough imagination, because I've been accused of being a materialist. In my world of science, some of the conjecture involves things like multiple universes, the nonlinearity of time, that every point in time may exist simultaneously at once. There's parts of modern physics that may require this. It's not proven yet, but things are kind of going that way. And, I think there could be an intelligence that exists in higher dimensions than we do, that may be able to see our entire lives at once, that may be so much like our definition of a God, you might as well call it that. That's possible. I don't really spend much time thinking about that, but I don't discount that. And I'm also not very impressed by, I love Stephen Fry, but I'm not very impressed when he says terrible things happen, therefore there cannot be a God. I could imagine an existence where if you look at the hyperdimensional extent of all of us, everything that could have possibly happened to us as a whole, maybe a terrible death is like a pimple on a beautiful being. I could see that. So I have found no need for an external God. And my morality is very intact. There are emotional and rational reasons to be moral beings. There's no good argument that atheists can't be moral. And there's also no saying that atheists don't need their own comfort. I am scared. Existence frightens me. I wish I had a social structure to help me through the phases of my life, like religion does. I find my own ways of doing it. We mentioned the nonlinearity of time and the fact that time may exist all at once. My husband and I are aging, and we cling to each other against existence, and we wish we had more time together. And I'll tell him, the Big Bang created all of time at once, from the start to the finish of our dimensions. And so when the universe began, I was holding your hand. And when the universe ends, I'll be holding your hand.
If only I could speak like that.
That's a tough act to follow. Does anyone of the panelists, any of you, wish to respond for a minute or two to anything any of the other panelists have said?
I provoked you deliberately, so.
Thanks, David.
Yes. I actually want to go to the origin of the Big Bang. Stephen Hawking a few years ago had a book that said you could explain the origin of the Big Bang as a quantum fluctuation in the primordial gravity field, and therefore you didn't need God to set things off. Of course, that was a terrible flaw in logic. If you define God as that which set off the Big Bang, and then you say that gravity is that which set off the Big Bang, all you've done is to prove that God is gravity. Which explains why Catholics celebrate Mass.
And that line has worked for 10 years.
It's still good.
It will work for a long time. No, I totally agree. Some of our peers who talk about how the Big Bang itself may have come out of a fluctuation in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and that is the basic notion that the product of your uncertainty in energy and your product of your uncertainty in time has to be greater than a certain amount, and that at a certain context of time, have enough time, then the fluctuation of energy, you could basically just borrow it and you get your Big Bang. In which case the answer is, in what context was Heisenberg's uncertainty principle operating? Now, there are all sorts of really, really cool things that are coming around, like, for instance, Lee Smolin's concepts that evolution has taken place among universes, and that universes give birth to new universes when they make black holes, and that therefore you would have an evolution of those universes which are the most fecund and have the most offspring are those that make the most black holes. And maybe that intelligent life is needed at some point in the universe's history in order to tailor-make just the right kinds of black holes, in which case that would explain why the anthropic principle, why the universe is so friendly to life. It's brilliant stuff. I even copied some of that into a short story. But the notion is that even if you do that, all you've done is created trillions of generations of evolving universes, and you still have to ask where the heck they came from.
I'd like to pick the scab a little. So, look, in many religions, and I'm, one of the socialist Christians. I'm a socialist Christian, which is absurd, but I know. I'm happy with it. There's a political split in most religions between those who gravitate towards empire, power, and the production of passivity, and those who gravitate towards equality, liberation, and action. Okay, and this is from someone I work with called Ruby Sales, who is an organizer as well as a religious person. And so I worked for 30 years at a think tank where we studied right-wing fundamentalism and other right-wing movements and taught people how to engage respectfully with people who believe in Scripture in a literal way. And so two things. One, yes, you're right that if you engage people from where they start and talk about religion in a way that is respectful and talk about where we are the same, and move people towards a space that's political, that works. But on the other hand, your description of how religion works is very one-sided and only describes that part of religion that has historically gravitated towards the bad side of empire, power, and passivity, and ignores, in both Protestantism and Catholicism, the people who worked for equality and peace and justice. And I think it's unfair for you to suggest that those of us who worked with the Catholic labor movement or the Catholic peace movement or the Protestant, civil rights movement or the Jewish civil rights movement, that we don't count. And so, I'm going to push back on that.
I don't recall actually saying that. What I have said is that there is a tendency in pyramidal systems for power to co-opt the established priesthood and use it to justify the continuation of feudal power. The kinds of things you're talking about, there were always pastoral people who went down and worked among the poor. There were always saints. But for them to be an influential part of established religion had to wait until we started creating the diamond-shaped social structure in which a vast middle felt empowered. And their values became the values of the priests who went down into the world.
So the current pope is chopped liver? What?
No, well, the current pope is, I believe, a product of his generation to some degree. And his generation he was out there dealing with the calamities of the church's affiliation with the tyrannies in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, and he was one of great many sincere priests who said, I can't deal with this sellout anymore. I was going to mention, think about priests. Not priests, saints. The basic deal of a saint is a business deal. You're offered eternal bliss and influence in exchange for a few hours of horrible, hellish torment on earth, or a lifespan, or a few decades of ministering to the poor. Well, if you look at it that way, it's a perfect business deal. And then it's just a matter of whether you believe it or not, you truly believe in the business deal. And secondly, whether you got the guts to stick it through the brief period of time that's way outweighed by that other thing. If you stop and think about it, and I'm being deliberately provocative here, it is a bit selfish and self-centered. Let me tell you what a super saint would do. A super saint would live her life totally good, take last rites, be a shoo-in for upper levels of heaven, and then commit a mortal sin deliberately in order to go where the real pain is. And minister to the damned. Now, it may be hopeless, so what? It may be arrogant, in which case you're consigned to exactly where you're going to go. Or it may be such a good act that your mortal sin is simply overruled and you're told, tough, you're coming up here anyway. In which case, you've just recruited a pest. Because she's going to be going all over ministering to the saintly, saying, what the hell is all this strumming?
Anyone else? Guy, Michelle? do you dare?
That's why they call it science fiction.
I will point out we're being awfully Judeo-Christian here. One of the things that I think is also an interesting idea is the intersection of non-Western religion and science. Mm-hmm. And by the way, this has not inspired me to become a Buddhist or a Hindu, but I actually get a lot of scientific humility from reading the Bhagavad Gita, where there's a famous passage between Arjuna and Krishna, where Arjuna is about to lead this battle. He's an incredible general, and he's having second thoughts. His friends are on the other side. People are going to be killed, and he says to Krishna, "What the hell is this? Why are we doing this? How did we get here? What is my life? Is this moral? Is this right?" And Krishna kind of says, "You really want to know? Yeah, you really?" And he lifts up the fabric of reality, and this is where the scientist comes in. Arjuna grasps a reality that the human brain just doesn't understand. Whether it's multiple dimensions, whether it's nonlinear time, whatever, any little scientific concept in there. I thought it was very interesting that people thousands of years ago who wrote the Vedas were already coming to terms with the idea that maybe the nature of the universe is not understandable by the human brain.
And you'll find that in Hebrew scripture as well, the vanity of vanities, famous passage from Ecclesiastes that Rabbi Sachs in Britain has recently retranslated. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. This sense of meaninglessness does not come from modern science. It comes from observing the universe and recognizing that, as I think it was Wittgenstein points out, you cannot find the meaning for something in the thing itself. Right.
Yes, well, this was, as I said, Socrates, Jesus, Buddha, and all of that. Look beyond. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that there came a saint named Galileo who said, "You're right, my senses are flawed. I can never know for sure what this is. But through experiment and back and forth with my colleagues, we can peel away and we can find out what this is not."
It's fascinating. Because I was at the Vatican Observatory, people keep asking me about Galileo. I actually started reading what he actually wrote. You can find a wonderful book on the Galileo affair, edited by a guy named Finocchiaro, which has translated into English all the things he wrote, all the things his enemies wrote, the transcript of the trial. If you go to Amazon, you'll find 400 biographies of Galileo, everyone telling them the truth of what really happened, and no two of them agreeing with each other. You can read this book and write 401 biographies. One of the real issues in debates like a science and religion debate is that you have people who know science but don't know religion. Right. And they're trying to figure out, well, those religious people must be like that because that's the way I'd be if I was one of them, which is very telling about what you are necessarily and more than what they are. And religious people who look at scientists because they don't know what science is and make exactly the same kinds of statements. It's revealing to live in both. And I'm reminded of the wonderful bumper sticker that says, I love God, it's his fan club I have a problem with. But I will remind you that, as someone who is a planetary scientist at the Vatican and has been there working for 20 years, I have had to deal intimately with a bureaucracy that's cumbersome and foolish and more often than not gets in your way, and more often than not you think, who are the people running this? They're total idiots. But I continue because I know that NASA is the only outfit that managed to get us to the moon.
Can't pray your rocket into space, huh?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a quick question, and then we'll open it up to discussion from the audience. I'd like to ask the panelists to quickly, if they can, comment on what I observe in this country as a recent trend of anti-science in government at the highest levels, senators, governors, and so forth. And I've been much surprised by this, and I wanted to ask where the panelists might think this is going in terms of the grand sweep of history, specifically American history. Where are we going with this, please?
The shortest answer is that it's not recent. It's happened throughout history, and we are experiencing one of these oscillations where there are people who are afraid, like I am, of where we are right now, and their solution involves basically coming up with a set of litmus tests that they think will make the population more coherent and able to function, and it targets people that I think should have basic human rights. This is not the first time it's happened. It is not the last time it will happen. It's something that requires, in a democracy at least, people getting engaged, because if most Americans voted, I think this group of people, which have absolute First Amendment rights to believe what they believe, but don't have First Amendment constitutional rights to take away rights from other people, that we will outnumber them. And by we, I mean the people who are religious and non-religious, who are left and right, who recognize that the Constitution and Bill of Rights was written by people who had something to think about and wrote it down, and we shouldn't stomp on it.
Part of that, I think, is to recognize that we can have friends we disagree with, and friends we can ally ourselves with on this particular issue when tomorrow we might disagree and be opposed. Mm-hmm. One of the sad things that's happened, and you certainly see this in the blogosphere, is that if I disagree with you on this one issue, you're condemned to eternal perdition, and you can find that on Daily Kos as much as you can find it, on Fox News.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't help anyone. There is the great temptation that, and I saw this growing up in the 60s, of the radicals who more wanted to feel good about themselves than to actually affect any change. That's something that I think is a great temptation to all of us.
Well, I do believe we are in phase 8 of the American Civil War, and when you have this, several things happen, and that is, one is appealing to simplistic metaphors, and the worst is the so-called left-right political axis, along which we all associate ourselves willy-nilly, and it's disgusting, it's ridiculous, and it's French.
Oh no!
There's more than enough reasons to abandon it, but the main thing is it's linear, it's one-dimensional. And why should we allow ourselves to get squashed onto it? I have long, as I've said, I believe that one should broaden oneself and be in many worlds, and this is one of the reasons why I study Scripture. I think that sometimes you have amazing things, juxtapositions, and I think that when it gets as bad as it is right now in this civil war, we have to realize that some of what we see is deliberate, because the destruction of politics in the United States, where nothing can be negotiated, we have lost our political system. Anyone who would do that to us is committing an act of treason or war, and it's been done deliberately in order to prevent politics from functioning. And this, as a major reason for this, is the denigration of every clade of intellect in American life, not just scientists. You cannot find, well, actually there are 3 exceptions, but you can hardly find any clade of intellect that is not under relentless attack on Fox News. Scientists are not alone. Civil servants, teachers, medical professionals, law professionals, anything you can possibly name, except divinity graduates and the military corps, because they learned from what's his face from the 50s not to attack them. What was him? McCarthy. Right. One final point on that political thing, and I hope it's my last one, is that I think we need to make this very, very clear to our neighbors. If religion should be kept out of politics if it's a matter of basic conscience, and it's just the details of a person who is of goodwill and conscience. But when you have people who are running for high office, who openly avow to pray daily for a sequence of events to occur as soon as possible that would result in the painful, agonizing deaths of 98% of their fellow citizens, followed by their eternal torment, the end of all democracy forever, and the end of the United States of America, because that's what it boils down to, then perhaps it is politically relevant whether or not they should be entrusted with our nuclear stockpile.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I have to reiterate the word deliberate. This is a deliberate wedge they're using to keep people distracted. From a little bit Marxist tendencies here. It's economics, I think. I mean, they're really keeping us, sort of dumb and fighting each other while the rich people keep creaming off even more stuff from the top. I mean, I think that's really what's going on.
That's some of the rich people. Those in this town in Silicon Valley, I think, are...
No, I'm speaking as one of the rich. I absolutely. I mean, I'm a civil servant, so I don't get filthy rich, but I'm very happy with my salary that's paid by your taxes, so thank you. It goes back to that heresy. We have much more in common than we have in differences between each other, right? How heretical is that? How much we have in common with other ethnicities or genders, or whether it's different sexual orientations. I mean, that's the heresy. We're all living these human lives, atheists versus believers. Yeah, that's the heresy. We all could work together, and they're deliberately trying to separate us and distract us.
If I can make a pitch, what can we do about this besides, picking up our pitchforks and going after them, wherever them happen to be? One of the surprising things that happened to me when I entered the Jesuits, I've been a scientist for 20 years, and I, didn't talk about religion because I figured, well, scientists don't want to know about that anyway. And besides, I'm sure I'm the only one. And then, as a Jesuit, I couldn't hide it anymore. I'd come out of the closet. Somebody came up to me, and this happened more than once, and said, "You go to church?" Which is the great surprise in their voice, like you could never tell from the way you lived, which tells you how I was living. And then they said, "Let me tell you about the church I go to." Oh, there's 2 of us. And then there's 4 of us. And then I suddenly realized half the people I knew were churchgoers. And their way they practiced religion is a whole lot more complicated than I would have thought. I wrote a book about it. And a lot of other people are wonderful people who don't happen to go to church. That's fine. A lot of people are terrible people who do go to church or don't go to church. We're all in this together. What I think we can do, if you find yourself as an intellectual who's also a member of a church, a scientist in particular who's also a member of a church, let the people in your church know. Let anyone there who thinks that they have to choose between church and science know that you didn't have to choose. And this witness to your church could be a very powerful way of reminding people that the people in your church who are not scientists shouldn't think of the scientists as them, but as us. A very powerful thing to do if you happen to be in that position, and you can do that in good conscience.
And there are famous scientists who were deeply religious, Einstein being the archetype, and he said that he thought that it was very telling that the laws of nature are so elegant and so elegantly understandable. The metaphor he used was that the workshop door had been left open and the lights on. And if you look back to some of the things I originally said here, that if you look into Scripture at the deepest, most telling, and most fundamental moments, that it appears to say, nothing is beyond us, we were meant to be co-creators, perhaps not quite as explicitly as the Scientologists and Mormons put it, but over time to co-create. As you can see, I've been jabbing here with my elbow because that's what we do. But in fact, you are not looking at an atheist.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panel, Chip, Guy, David, and Michelle. Thank you very much.
Questions? Yes.
We have about 14 minutes for questions, and no long statements, please, just questions. Any students? Your student? Okay, you please come first. And then one over here? Okay. Yes, the student, please.
Yeah,
To which panelist do you wish to address your question?
Okay.
Or to anyone.
I guess this is open to everyone, but it was a particular statement you made about, I believe, science as an act of worship. And I'm just wondering, this is kind of drawn out, so I apologize, but A, how can we perhaps remove bias from science? Or do we want to? And B, are certain acts of science, can they be considered ethical or an act of worship? I understand that kind of planetary science is a bit far removed, but in the field of developmental biology, there's a lot of altering embryo and creating kind of these crazy hopeful monsters of organisms. So where do we draw the line between morality and can we use religion as a basis of that? Is that scientific? Yeah, there you go. That's for really anybody. Yeah.
That's the important difference is between the science and the technology. There's nothing immoral about understanding how the atom works. There is something immoral about building a bomb and dropping it on people. You can't do the latter without the former. But even if all your technology consists of is a rock, you can still decide to use it to bash your neighbor over the head. We're always going to be faced with those issues. Furthermore, whether I don't do it, somebody else is going to. So we're always going to be faced with the fact that there will be negative consequences to all of our actions. I think that knowledge is good. I don't think it's simply neutral. I believe knowledge is good. I believe that even if you say you're an atheist, if you're dedicated to finding out what's true and not just what's going to get me a grant, then you're worshiping something bigger than yourself. You're worshiping something transcendent. And in that sense, coming to the truth is what I meant by an act of worship. But absolutely, we have to be worried about what's right and wrong. And the best way to do this at the end of the day is to not do it alone. Because I'm real good at talking myself into believing whatever I'm doing is the right thing. I need a community of scientists to tell me if my data are really screwed up because I only cherry pick the ones I want. I need a community of other people who are looking at the ideas of right and wrong. There's a wonderful story if I can just go on a little bit longer, in a book on ethics that I had to read as part of my theology course by a fellow named Stephen Tomlin, who was asked to sit on a committee at a hospital to judge whether or not certain experiments could be done on patients who are not in a position to give informed consent, because they're children, because they're unconscious, whatever. And he looked at the people on the committee. He said, we'll never agree on even what room to sit in because there's one of everything. But in practice, virtually all of the issues were decided unanimously. Everybody could look at it and say, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. No, you don't want to do that. And I have faith that with a group of people, the biases, the more data you have, the more likely the biases are to balance each other out.
Thank you for your question.
One thing I might just comment quickly on, sorry, is remember that the word ethics doesn't imply religion. That you can be ethical and not have religion in your life.
Right. Yes.
And so the idea, there's so many ways to look at this. I mean, there is the idea that I am a creature like you, and I the golden rule makes a lot of sense to me. There's also something called game theory, which you might want to look into, where you can model how moral systems are actually an evolutionary advantage. And perhaps that's the basis of our morality and our ethics, is mathematics. And what works in a large system of interacting groups.
The thing that made Judaism special that you see in the Old Testament is our God gave us these moral laws, which no other religion has done, which says, if nothing else, moral laws are not necessarily the function of a religion. It was a feature, not an essential.
But if you want to determine the difference between our moralities systems and how they've evolved, study the difference between what's called a zero-sum game and the positive-sum game. It is the concept all of you are going to have to spread that's independent of the left-right axis. And the positive-sum game, the moral rules used to be zero-sum. The moral rules are now positive-sum. And I don't have time to explicate, but I will say that the greatest prayer that if I were a Mormon God, if I were a God, the difference between, oh, you're so great, oh, you're so wonderful, and please expunge original sin, versus someone like you in a lab, having studied the math of the titration the night before, and then doing it in the lab, and then saying, oh, that's neat. Well, thank you very much. I was very pleased. I'm glad you noticed. 14 billion years ago, I'm glad somebody's finally noticed.
Thank you, David. We're going to have to move to this. Thank you for your question and answer. And we need to do this very quickly. We have another student, please.
Okay, my question's directed towards Michelle, but I would appreciate all of you touching on it. Do you believe that religion will continue to slowly dissipate, vanish, and people will simply believe in morality and science without relying on a god or a religion? And if so, how long do you estimate this would take? And what would be the positive and negative effects of...
Can you do it 1 minute?
I don't believe that'll happen. No, I don't think there's any evidence of it. I think that religions can come and go. I'm actually quite a big fan of the Greek gods, I think that if there are changes in fashion in religion, there will be new ones that come along. I think this is a very, very deeply ingrained human behavior. I think it's an incredibly successful evolutionary meme. So, I think there will always be religion. I think that when we create artificial brains, Battlestar Galactica, I think that when we actually have cyborgs, they may form their own religions. I don't know whether there's going to be much of a change in the evolution. I don't have a great answer for you. The one thing to remember, a lot of times people sort of separate America into the believers and non-believers, and the real America are the more conservative people, the people who are believers. There's a tremendous, as a scientist, all of my friends are, similar strains of belief. We think that we can coexist. I don't think there's ever going to be a time without religion.
I agree. Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Wow, we all agree.
I would like comment on the aspect you haven't discussed, which is the scientific study of religion or, let's say, spirituality. Context, I'm not interested in this being dismissed because spirituality is supernatural. Naturally, you need a other definition of it, like it's how we deal with the defects of our brains and minds. But I would like some comment on this other direction.
Yeah, it's called theology. And it was the first science, and I'm not being flip about that. There was a difference, as you point out, the difference between spirituality and religion. There's a difference between religion and theology. The the physical universe is there. Science is trying to figure out how it works. And if we get the science wrong, it doesn't mean the physical universe went away. If you believe in God, God is there. Theology is our way of trying to figure out how it works. If our theology is flawed, which is likely to be as if our science is flawed, that just means you have to go back to the starting board and start over again. But theology was the first science, and an awful lot of what we do in science were techniques invented by the theologians in the Middle Ages.
Or the alchemists.
Thank you.
There is a discipline called sociology that studies the religion scientifically, and let's just not discard the entire discipline in this conversation.
There's also the physical study of what happens during religious and spiritual experiences. You know, I mean, you put somebody in an MRI, we can induce states of religious euphoria. You know, there's a physical basis for it. When we understand our human brains, we will understand where some of these needs and emotions come from.
And just because you can see the thing doesn't mean it isn't real.
Right.
Just because if you didn't see it, then you say, I mean, I can induce these states by sitting in a beautiful church listening to lovely music.
Absolutely.
Well, William James started this more than about 140 years ago, the studying of varieties of religious experience. And you spoke of personal experience. And the problem comes up when you believe what your parents told you, that yours is the only way to achieve that mental state.
Right.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Quickly.
Yes. I would like to challenge you that the Big Bang is scientifically impossible.
But there it is.
No, it was not. The reason is the very definition of a Big Bang is a very big sound. And sound needs a medium to be carried, and there is no medium in space to carry the sound.
This actually goes back to George Lemaitre.
This does go back to George Lemaitre.
Yeah.
It was a big bright. Just like it says in the Bible.
Right.
God didn't say, let there be a Big Bang. He said, let there be a bright light.
When the name Big Bang was invented, it was invented by Fred Hoyle to make fun of Lemaitre's theory. Lemaitre and Hoyle actually met at a scientific conference at the Vatican Observatory in the 1950s, became best of friends, and went on vacations together. So absolutely, all of, you talk about literalism in Scripture, literalism in science is equally silly. Particles are not particles.
But it turns out that some of the math we're using for studying the WMAP backgrounds is sonic, is acoustic.
I'd also like to know...
wait, there's other
Sir,
people.
we need to move on to the next question.
This young student right here, she's been Yes, you?
I'm not a student.
Oh.
This gentleman is next. Sir, you may proceed.
So you just touched on something that was really interesting, which is literalism. And the question arises as to how to best engage literalists, and to what allows that conversation to move forward. It's a difficult kind of thing.
It comes a little bit from where your background is and what they know of you. If all you're trying to do is to trap them and trick them, whoever you're talking to is going to see through that pretty quickly. You also have to remember that no one was ever converted by a syllogism. People become closer to you when they see that you're somebody they want to be with or even be like. And that means you have to be one of those people, which is real tough. More to the point, I think it's important to recognize, as I was saying, Newton's law of gravity is a metaphor. The solution to this equation is like the speed of a falling object. But all of life and all of descriptions are metaphors. That's how we use words to describe things that are not words.
Thank you.
Last question, there's a difference between tragic literalism and comedic literalism. Comedic literalism is, this is what I believe, but I don't know really. And that actually is in a lot of religious experience. There are a lot of people who go, this is what I believe, but I don't know what I don't know, so let's not kill people over it.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm a CU alum, not a student, so I guess maybe that counts halfway. I have a quick request for David before my question. The stereotype of the angry militant atheist is just as absurd as the stereotype of the anti-science believer. I, like Michelle, am happy and loving, and nature is my something greater. So she's my new hero.
I don't.
And
What did
my
I
quest-
say that was okay?
You mentioned the angry atheist stereotype.
There are angry atheists,
But not all of us.
I didn't say that.
My question is, you mentioned a passage in the Bible that's pro-science, the naming of the beasts. Do any of you know of passages in the other books, like the Quran, that are pro-science that could be shared with their believers to help them understand that science is not the enemy? And if we don't know of any of those passages, should we all be looking for those?
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all share those passages.
It is worth saying in the Quran there's a slightly more mention of the fact that there may be many. In the Quran there's more explicit mention of the possibility of life outside the earth. You know that there are some passages that talk about he shall bring them all together, the disparate tribes of. I don't actually know the passage from the Quran, but a number of Islamic friends of mine have talked to me about this. You know, that's one thing that it depends on your interpretation. But I've heard some Islamic friends of mine talk about their interpretation of this meaning life outside the world.
And the point you're making is really important. That kind of message can only be spoken by somebody who's inside the tent.
Exactly.
And so for me to write a book of telling the Muslims what they should believe would be probably counterproductive. But if I, as a member of the Vatican Observatory, can go to Catholic churches and remind my fellow Catholics that, Protestant literalism and fundamentalism, that's a Protestant idea, don't do that, then I get a better response.
Thank you. Thank you, man. Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, David. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you to the Conference on World Affairs. Good day. That's yours. You don't want to make everybody's here.
Yes.
No, I don't.
It's called.
I've actually studied